on prescribed fire and post-fire restoration here in the Pacific Northwest. A reminder that tomorrow, also at 4 p.m., we'll be having our last set of speakers, Cassie Meigs and Jason Lazar. Today we have two awesome speakers with us, Ralph Bloemers and Tom DeMeo. We're going to follow the same format as last week, where each speaker will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for questions at the end. So I guess we can jump into it. First, we'll be hearing from Ralph, and basically I'll be giving a short bio from stuff we've gathered online for each speaker before they present. So Ralph is a senior staff attorney at the Crag Law Center and has represented dozens of conservation and community groups throughout the Pacific Northwest in efforts to protect older forests. He has led educational forums in communities affected by fire and spent time with school kids to address the trauma of fire and explore burned forests. He volunteers regularly to rebuild trails and fire-burned areas. So Ralph, you want to take it over?
All right. Well, good to be here, and I'm going to try to pack quite a bit here in 20 minutes. So I wasn't born a lawyer. I was born most of my life spent in the country on a farm, on a cheese farm, and a lot of time outdoors. And over the last 20 years, I've had the honor and privilege of working with a lot of different scientists and been exposed to things that I was never exposed to before, including burned landscapes, which in the beginning, I thought, what's there going to be for me? It's burned up. At least that's what I had been told. And my journey of discovery started shortly after I was contacted by a whistleblower who told me that most of the trees there that they were planning to log were live and unlikely to die and shouldn't be cut. And over time, I got to learn more and more. And then the Eagle Creek fire came along. And in the Eagle Creek fire, you know, that was in the heart of the gorge, a beloved place. And a kid threw a firework and ignited the fire. You know, 9 out of 10 fires are started by people, whether it's power companies or a kid or some other negligent act or even intentional arson. And, you know, this brings back a lot of feelings for people. But it's just one of those things, you know, we're going to have fire on the land and it's going to be ignited somehow. And I was driving back through the fire right before, like 5 minutes before they closed the road, spent a lot of time out in the gorge, restoring some forest land out there. And I was headed back. And I just remember the tiny little buckets, what looked like tiny little buckets, you know, spitting on this massive wind-driven wildfire. And the images were powerful and the smoke was in Portland, so it got a lot of people's attention. Me, being kind of the fire obsessive that I am, saw immediately an opportunity for education. I didn't even go through any other stages or grief. I just knew it was a wild, dynamic landscape and that it was always subject to change as much as we liked it the way that it was. That's why we liked it, because it was wild and dynamic. Congressman Walden came on the scene and he said this.
Burn 48,000 acres. If there isn't a more destructive clear cut than that, I don't know what it is.
If there isn't a more destructive clear cut than that, I don't know what it is. So that was the message. 48,000 acres was destroyed, was consumed. And I headed into the forest with people that I knew, whether it was on trail work parties or with a state park ranger. And I was hungry for every baseline image that I could get, every access that I could get. And I started with time-lapse photography, you know, and gathering maps on the fire progression. Now, within that 50,000 acre burn perimeter, 8,000 acres burned at high severity. And I specifically targeted the high severity burned patches, the destroyed, the catastrophically burned, all that catastrophic rhetoric stuff places to see what was going on in there. We did aerial photography. We gathered ODOT's aerial photography. We made a flyover with John Bailey from OSU that was in the Oregonian. You know, but the reality is that these landscapes have evolved with fire since the retreat of the ice sheets in the Pleistocene. And they know what to do. And there's volcanoes, there's landslides, there's floods, there's all kinds of things that have shaped the gorge and Western landscapes over much longer timescales than ours. And a lot of it has to do with paradoxes, right? We like them because as we know them, and then when they prove themselves to be dynamic, we're upset about it, and it affects our lives. Now, shifting back to the things that we're all sort of marinated in, myself included, was this perspective that fire was a waste, that it was destructive. And really this was framing, done by Smokey Bear and his handlers for good reason, which was to try to reduce human caused ignitions. But it really sends a very negative message around fire, not a coexistence, reimagine your relationship with fire type message that I feel we really need. And Bambi was on the scene for a short little while with Smokey, and then Disney said, no, we're going to keep Bambi for ourselves. Bambi, commentators have said that Bambi is the single most influential, more than all scientific papers combined, of people's views of wildlife and forests and their relationship. And it's pretty fascinating if you look at some of the media studies. And so I really wanted to understand that. What was shaping people's views? And, the scene of Bambi escaping from the flames, but at the end, we'll come back to that. What's going on? Everybody loses when a forest burns. Is this really true for wildlife? And if it's not true, how can you show that to people? Not tell them, not ask them to read science papers. That was my mission. How can you show them? So I did this in my free time. I found some fun stuff out there. I found a picture of Smokey with a drip torch. That's from the Modoc Forest. And of course, I found a lot of the messages out there. I like my forest green, not black. Which do you prefer? These, false frames that it's either log decks or the immediately aftermath of a burned forest. Of course, this is immediately after the fire that they're showing. But this is, what they're promoting, which is you got to cut it down to bring it back. And this is in California, some aerial imagery we took down there. And of course, it kind of all goes back to Yellowstone. And I would hold up and highly recommend this book to folks, which is Media and Apocalypse. And it's not coming through, but it's by Conrad Smith. And this is a guy who loved Yellowstone and saw in the news that Yellowstone burned up and was destroyed and went out there to see for himself. And he was a media studies professor. And he was like, whoa, what's going on? It's actually pretty fantastic. So I kind of set out to show what Conrad and many others have taught me, which is the amazing regenerative properties and the survival of wildlife through the lens. And you have lots of good stuff that's come before me that I borrowed from this book called The Charcoal Forest that focuses on Rocky Mountain ecosystems, studies by scientists comparing, technology that's been borrowed, like this is the space shuttle. The tiles on the space shuttle were borrowed from ponderosa pines. Ponderosa pines are able to diffuse heat. They're thick, just like the tiles on the space shuttle. And that's why they survive many fires. And there's many plants and animals that have adaptations to fire. So creativity came on the scene first. This is the Holiday Farm Fire, and I recovered a wildlife camera that showed fire burning through. And this is a pretty long clip, so I'm gonna skip ahead. It burns through, and you can see here, this is 9/9. Camera reaches 89 degrees, and then the next morning, the deer are back. And that's pretty fantastic. And a lot of other animals. This is on the McKinsey, on Barry Lopez's property. One of the other animals that loves burns are all these cavity nesting birds, particularly black-backed woodpeckers. What I've noticed is that the old growth forests are pretty quiet, but the burn forests are a cacophony of noise and activity. Fantastic if you're a bird lover. And just how the birds' relationships, some are the cavity excavators, and then some are not excavators, but nesters. And this is a bunch of footage we got for a film that I just completed with funding National Geographic that was a 5-year project, which I'll get back to at the end. So in the gorge, it took to the air, took to the air to show the mosaic, right? This is all within this destroyed 50,000 acre perimeter, but you can see it's pretty mosaic. A lot of the most heavily burned stuff is the most visible from I-84, but just over the ridge, it turns green again. So I was on the ground a lot, falling down a lot, wrangling cameras, learning as I went. But immediately the ferns came out, the trillium came back, the morels, the Indian paintbrush. And I connected up with a buddy of mine who's a National Geographic Young Explorer there in the background. And he taught me a little bit about certain things, how to do it. And we set up these time-lapse cameras. And so we set them up low down in a friend's place that has a private inholding in the gorge, because that was the first one we got permission for. As we were going, we would see lots of lilies coming in. And then the other thing I started to really get into was historic photos. So this is Mirror Lake from 1933, and then Mirror Lake just recently, and Burnt Lake from 1933, and I only have a black and white photo, and Burnt Lake from 2017. And making these really cool transitions to allow people to see. This is from Sherrard Point, Larch Mountain, looking at Mount Hood over the gorge, backside of the gorge. So you can kind of see in a lifetime, in a lifetime what happens. And the notion being to get people to step out of their own human timescales with this information. The trail work was super fun. This is a prison work crew that I helped carry a big beam because one person got pretty tired. But it was also awesome because the gorge was closed and I was desperate to get in there. But so what I was able to get on those trail work parties was baseline photos. So at the top you can see right after the burn, and then below you see, I think 2 years later, I took that during the pandemic when everything was closed, they still let me in there. And I love to have the features. So you like the rock features, because then no one can deny you're taking it they can't say you're taking it in a different place. Like this one's great because it has the rock feature in the background. And there's a lot of doubters, right? They don't want to believe how quickly it can come back, but look at how, and this is actually an area that burned in 96 and then burned again in 2017. And it's fun to go out and hunt and find and to match the trees up, and you can see how long the snags still stand and what life they're giving. So let's see, there's another one at the top of Angel's Rest. And then I started to see a lot of wildlife evidence. I was like, oh, I got to start doing wildlife cameras. So let's see here. It's giving me a little bit of being a little weird. So then I did some aerials. And for the aerials, I was able to find ODOT photos and then aerially match them because state parks did give me the permission to put a bird up in the air to take pictures, which is way easier for matching. And this is a very prominent feature. So then you can see what it looks like 2 years later. Pretty fantastic. Nature doing its thing.
The fire has destroyed 33,000 acres and it's only about 5% contained.
So the media also said the fire destroyed 33,000 acres. And I went to a lot of different places, including this spot, which I don't know if this video is coming through, but you can see this is about 2,000 feet up above I-84. Quite the effort to get there. I don't disclose exact locations to folks, but that's where I was. And up there, I got, green coming back really quick. I got, let's see real quick. Skip ahead. I got a lot of wildlife. Here's a bear munching on fireweed, just loving all the new growth. And when I put your camera in a cage as a bear comes along and pushes it to the ground. So I got a fair bit of this. And quickly decided after all that effort to put everything in cages. But what's fun about this is then you get the birds and you get the little bugs and you get to see all the other little critters. So this happened for a reason, but the bears were plentiful up there. And I would go up there and I would find this guy regularly, really regularly. And this took me 2 years to get this shot. Which is the bear with the gorge in the background. I worked really hard for that one. This is up on the north side of Mount Hood in the Dollar Lake fire. Everything around this burned at high severity except for this one little wetland patch. So it looks really green. You're like, are you even in a fire burned area? Let me guarantee you it's thousands of acres of silver snags. And this cinnamon black bear was there. This cinnamon black bear pushed my camera to the ground literally 4 hours after I left, or maybe 8 hours after I left, and I came back 2 months later. I did get bobcats and stuff underneath the camera as it was smushed to the ground and stuff. Here's the closing scene to Bambi. Now look at that. It's a beautiful charcoal forest, right? And there's a charcoal bottom burned tree. There's Hootie Owl. There's all the critters coming back. They're all alive. They're very happy. See, they're on a charcoal snag. But this is not what people remember from the film. They remember fire. They remember death. And it is forever seared in their belief that most wildlife is killed by fire. Now, the top experts tell me that 90 to 95% of wildlife survive most fires, including the wind-driven fires, because the large mammals can move pretty fast, and the ground speed of even in a wind-driven fire is about 1/10 of the wind speed. So if it's a 30-mile-an-hour wind speed, it's a 3-mile-an-hour ground fire. Even if it's a 60, it's a 6-mile-an-hour ground fire. They can move, they know where to go, the birds fly away, the small mammals burrow into the ground. I have pretty much not found any dead animals in any burns that I've been into, and I've been into them right after. And so, you know, what this calls for, and I'm working with some creative folks on this, and that was the title of my talk, is Real Bears Love Burns, on this new character, which, you know, she enjoyed her time with her great uncle Smokey, but she wants to deliver a new message, and her name is Ember. And she wants to bring back the burn, and she wants to show people what are the benefits and help them reimagine their relationship with fire, because babes evolved with fire. And this is done in collaboration with Margot Robbins from the UROC and a couple other creatives. And there is a nascent Instagram page for it. And I found that kids also love the burn. This is a kid actually messing with one of my cameras with his hammer, doing some trail work. He found it.
You hit it.
And
I heard you go. No, that was just me hitting the tree. No, you hit that.
they luckily didn't do any damage to it. But up here at this same location, there is, I was told I wouldn't find any elk. I found massive, huge elk, lonely bull elk. I found, the videos aren't playing well. This lonely bull many times. Up in the Dollar Lake fire, I got lots of cougar, and that's me setting on cameras and what that looks like. I have a variety of different kinds. But the avalanche lilies up there were fantastic. So what I do is I get time-lapse, wildlife, and matches, aerial shots, everything I can possibly get. I try to show a bigger story with that. And sometimes I get lucky and I just happen to get a picture of wildlife in one of the time-lapse cameras. One of my favorites is this guy, Lewis. He's a lone bull, and I have probably 48 hours of him hanging out in this location because I think it's his area where he sleeps. Scratching the back of his neck when he's laying down with his hind leg, just looking at the camera, totally comfortable with that spot. Since the big fires in 2020, I have been in Opal Creek, and I have cameras up in Battle Axe with permission of the Forest Service. I got this cougar in Battle Axe, which didn't burn as severely. I got this, I think it's a mink on a log, which is the first time I've ever gotten a mink. I think this is a Sierra Nevada red fox, which is awesome, which was unexpected. And I hope when I go back in 2 weeks from now, that I'll have more evidence that it is daytime shots of Sierra Nevada red fox. Again, look at this. This is 2 years, total black and brown to total green. It's really fantastic to be in there. And then I've also gotten lots of cougars, and I've gotten them where I show up and I check my camera and they were there 6 hours before me, which certainly makes me look over my shoulder and wish that I had a friend with me, but that's okay. I don't think they want anything to do with me. I will almost done. I will just share a couple other resources if you want to check out more. I have some nighttime shots of cougar these are 4K. They made it high resolution. They made it into the film. But for those of you that sort of really want some inspiration on how to talk about burn forest, this is my absolute favorite. If I were going to give a fire book to a member of Congress, I'd give them this because they'd read it to their grandkids and something would soak into their brains about it. It is so fantastic. There's this Dottie the Owl online at thrivingwithfire.com, thrivingwithfire.org. You can check out 6 videos I was tertiarily involved with making. And some of OSU's top scientists are in those films. This is Boone Kaufman and Lisa Ellsworth Johnson, who I've learned a ton from. And you can see the 6 episodes. And then for Ember, these are some of the initial creative pieces. We're working on a book and other materials for the Klamath School District, but you can see Ember on Instagram. So follow Ember as she develops if you're into that kind of thing. Tons more videos on Thriving with Fire. And for Elemental, you can go to Elemental Film, which should be out premiering in May, hopefully at Mountain Film, fingers crossed. And then on the streaming service, Elemental focuses most intensively on how do we keep homes and communities safe, and Dr. Jack Cohen's work in home hardening, but it also has extensive footage and wildlife photography and time-lapse photography that I personally did for the film. So that's what I have for you today. And I'm also, you can find me at ralph@crag.org, and feel free to reach out if you would like to learn more or get access to any of these resources. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, thank you, Ralph. Yeah, so I guess if there are any immediate questions, we can answer them now. If not, I can move on to Tom, and then we can circle back to collective questions. Okay, cool. So for Tom's intro, so Tom is a regional ecologist, USDA Forest Service in the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest region, Portland, Oregon. He received a BS in Forest Service or in Forest Science from Penn State, a master's in Forest Science from Oregon State, and a PhD in wildlife biology from West Virginia University. He has worked in his current position for over 20 years, working on vegetation ecology, mapping and restoration strategies, and the implementation of fuels and landscape monitoring. So Tom, if you want to take over.
Sure. Can everybody see that okay? Thumbs up or not? Well, thank you for your time this afternoon. And that's a very difficult presentation to follow because it was very interesting and very entertaining. So I hope I can hold on to your attention for a few more minutes this late in the day. What I'm going to talk about is post-fire restoration, which is a huge issue in natural resources, maybe the main issue right now, and use the bootleg fire as a case study with some work we've been doing. So what's driving all this interest in post-fire restoration? Well, we know that fires are getting larger and fire seasons longer, and that's very well documented and not a surprise to anybody on this call. Fires can generate enormous community and economic damage. We're seeing some fires at a magnitude not seen in recent history. And climate change is exacerbating this further and may be creating novel trajectories. In other words, things we haven't seen before. So what are the challenges that we're facing? There are many. The sheer magnitude is challenging federal and state agencies already weakened by years of downsizing. It's challenging, as Ralph conveyed in his presentation, to find consensus on restoration strategies. And climate change just adds to further complexity. Things are getting more difficult to predict. There are enormous operational challenges in getting reforestation done, given our personnel shortages, lack of funding, and matching appropriate seed stock because the climate is changing. What was an appropriate genetic mix for a site is changing over time as things get warmer and drier. Reburns, we're seeing areas burn again and again, and I have an example here from Southwest Oregon, the Silver Fire, and then some of that reburned with Biscuit and some of that reburned with Checo Bar. So we're seeing this reburn issue. Fires have grown in size. This came out of an experience I had on the August complex. That fire, I looked it up because there was a incident commander who was interested in a particular fire in 2008. So I started digging through this, and all the fires in California in 2008 combined in area were smaller than the August complex. And that's only 12 years, that change. We're also starting to see more unexpected and, in quotation marks, fire behavior, such as the Labor Day 2020 fires. And there's a sense that Oregon is becoming more like California in our fire seasons. So how do you form consensus on what to do about it? And Ralph eloquently described some of that. There's a lot of different interest groups with different perspectives. Some see fire as a natural process and we should just leave things alone, let nature restore things. There's a timber industry that may advocate for more aggressive logging as a way to stop fires. Those of us in federal agencies tend to think in terms of priorities and what can we do with limited resources. And in recent years, and I would ask everybody to pay attention to this, there's renewed interest in indigenous Native American burning practices. And I think this needs a lot more attention. It's been ignored for decades. I think it's finally starting to get some traction, and that we should all listen and start thinking seriously about incorporating traditional practices. Climate change as the new normal, longer fire seasons, maybe more to the point, there's a lot more uncertainty in weather patterns. We used to say, well, if you want to know what the fire season is going to be like, look at the weather in June. And I don't know if that's true anymore. I think the patterns are too unpredictable. Last year started in Oregon about a month early. California, they say, has a 12-month fire season now. If you go to a certain part of the state at one time or another, it's under fire risk all year round. We're going to see more frequent droughts. The southwestern US is having an unprecedented drought right now. And there's a growing sense that what once worked will not work anymore. The tactics that were effective at fighting a 10,000 acre fire may no longer work with a 1 million acre fire. And I think we need to take a hard look at that. Given the challenges, what are the opportunities? Well, one thing is, on the plus side, is that it has everybody's attention. Research and academia, the management agencies, the general public, Congress, they're all focused on fire and restoring after them. Another big plus is the collaborative movement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're starting to see significant funding for this. It's been growing for years, but the recent infrastructure bill has a significant amount of funding to deal with fires, not just the fighting of fires. The agencies, academia, NGOs are all pivoting to increase their focus on post-fire restoration. For example, the Pacific Northwest Research Station has the West Side Fire Initiative, and now a newly commissioned effort in post-fire focus with California, Oregon, Washington, and the 2 research stations. There's a lot of brainstorming and recognition of these new future, the novel problems we're going to be facing. The collaborative movement has been building over the last 20 years in natural resources. We now have a 10-year plus history of success in our collaborative forest landscape restoration program, which was commissioned by Congress. We're starting on the second 10 years now. Although far from perfect, the collaborative efforts help reduce conflict between the interest groups and get more work done on the landscape. Funding support, as I mentioned, is increasing, and a huge boost recently with the infrastructure bill, where the Pacific Northwest Forest Service is expected to get almost $200 million for restoration. So now I'd like to pivot and talk about the bootleg fire as a particular case study of how we apply this. The bootleg fire, I'm sure you're all aware, was last summer. And interestingly, it was a relatively short-lived fire, only about 5 weeks. Fires in the Cascades in Southwest Oregon often go on for months. I think it was relatively quick because that country is more gentle and it's more like the Great Basin in its topography. And I think, the elevator speech might be that it burned fast and hot and was over relatively quickly. Burned about 413,000 acres, which makes it the 3rd largest fire in recorded Oregon history. And at one point in mid-July, it was burning 1,000 acres per hour. So that's over a square mile per hour. Here's are the burn maps. That's the raw satellite image on the left, and then modeled what we call ravage report on the severity. And bootleg came out at 56% high severity, which is much more than your typical Cascade or Southwest Oregon fire, which tends to be around 20%. Biscuit was 19%, for example. So a lot of high severity on this fire. So this fall, after the bootleg fire, a restoration planning team was formed by the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, which is where bootleg is primarily located. And they contracted with an organization called American Forests to develop their planning effort on this, how to best proceed with post-fire restoration. No lack of concerns really, but some of the things that we covered on a field trip in late October, first and foremost was ecological resiliency of maintaining and building that in the resulting landscape, where to focus on tree planting, given limited resources, but lack the ecology of the area. Meadow restoration, invasives are always an issue in post-fire landscapes, and I think it's getting increasing concern, but also our treatments to help reduce fire effects of thinning and prescribed burnings can also sometimes foster invasives. So it's a complicated issue. Wildlife habitat needs, adapting to a changing climate, and then the ever-present issue of how do you get all your stakeholders to agree on what to do, particularly from the local tribes. So one of our guiding frameworks comes from some work done in California, post-fire restoration framework for national forests in California. And they use 6 guiding principles to restore key ecological processes, consider the landscape context, promote regional biodiversity, sustain ecosystem services, establish a prioritization approach for management interventions, and incorporating adaptation to agents of change. And then here's a simple flow chart. Another way to look at that is you assemble your team, identify resources, gather and analyze your spatial data, your assessment phase, and use a post-fire flow chart to identify opportunities, develop and integrate restoration options, and then build a restoration portfolio. And notice it's a portfolio or a set of options more than one decisive item. One of the things in recent years we tend to look at is the natural range of variation, the mix of seral stages and ecological processes on the landscape. And what we want to do to maintain or foster resiliency is the situation improving or maintaining from the fire, from our treatments, or is it degraded, is it departed? And there are ways to assess and analyze that we don't have time today to go into great depth, but we are using this in the bootleg fire landscape. We're doing a departure assessment to identify needs by seral stage and vegetation type. And you might say, so what? Well, one of the great advantages of this is it helps identify where, if any, reforestation is needed. It'll help identify how much early seral is needed by vegetation type, and that will in turn influence whether we plant areas or not. We're working through opportunities and constraints. We're working closely with leadership to align with their intent. And we're using a matrix concept to organize our activities. And I don't need to go into great depth here, but it's a way to take the different issues and organize them by their ecological need, their resource need, the practical constraints, the public support. And really, these are the 4 dimensions of restoration. Although I don't think I've ever seen it published anywhere, but this is what it comes down to. What's the ecological need, and what's our resource need? And then what are the constraints on that, or the efficacy? There are some things that are desirable to do ecologically, but we may not be able to do them. A good example is cheatgrass. We'd all love to get rid of cheatgrass, but there's just no practical way to do it, perhaps in certain targeted areas. And then what's the public support for what you want to do, which will ultimately determine the political support for what you want to do. And you can't ever ignore that part of it. So a few examples here on the ground. This is within the bootleg fire imprint. This is an area that had been thinned only before the fire. And you can see there's a fair amount of scorching on the tree crowns. And this is an area that was both thin and prescribed burned before bootlegging. You can see that the crowns are much more intact, that there's much less damage to the tree overstory. And if you want to look at this at a landscape perspective, you can see this middle block here in the photo was thinned and prescribed burn, and all the canopies are still green. And then this area over here was thinned only. You can see there's quite a bit of scorching. And then this area here in the foreground did not receive any treatment, and a very high degree of crown mortality there. The timeline for our work is we're still in that assessment phase of developing the initial framework, but that's nearing completion. And then American Forests will be tasked with developing the NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, documentation for action. And we're hoping to have those documents done for the forests by late spring. Going forward, our work presents some unique opportunities for innovative approaches. One of the things I'd like to see is more involvement by the tribes, and in this case, it's the Klamath tribe, up front in helping to shape what happens on this landscape with that idea of incorporating indigenous traditional practices. I'd like to see that happen. I think this would be one of the first times that we use departure assessment in a very thorough way to help target what we're going to do. And then, of course, whatever we do will help inform other efforts. And it's always building on lessons learned, right? We learned from what came before, and those that follow will learn from us. And before I close, just a few acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge everybody on this bootleg post-fire restoration planning team, putting a lot of effort into this. I'd also like to acknowledge Emery Navunchal and Max Wahlberg from our ecology program in the region who contributed to this presentation. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there's time, or if we want to go back to Ralph's presentation, that's fine.
Do you have any questions? Also, folks can put questions in the chat too. Oh, Dean?
Yeah, this would go out to both Tom and Ralph. We talked a lot about land, but not much really about streams in the process. And obviously we have erosional issues and things like that, loss of cover, change in temperature. Do either you want to discuss how that needs to be restored in the process of restoration?
Ralph, you want to go first?
Well, I can have observations on a variety of things around fire. So that's a pretty broad question. I mean, I was here to talk about wildlife and time lapse and that kind of photography stuff, but I do spend time with all the issues. I've seen a lot of the post-fire cutting that ODOT managed along the McKinsey, the Clackamas, the Santiam, the Little North Fork of the Santiam, and I'm very concerned about that. I have seen the effort to replant that with Arbor Day Foundation money, and I've seen that in last summer's heat dome, most of those little baby trees burned up. So if you're talking about a burn landscape, logged versus unlogged, according to Dr. Boone Kaufman, it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on average if it's burned and logged. Think of each one of those trees that's left, those snags, as sundials that hold, and moisture retention sponges that hold that moisture and help that recovery. If you cut that whole area, you are just making it super hard. And I'm hearing increasingly that the planting has to happen in the winter and at the latest in the early spring to be able to survive the summer. And I've just seen how trees come back in, whether it's a wet West Cascade or an Eastern Oregon forest, by just spending, like Tom has, countless hours in these burned forests. Now, another thing, I mean, there's been some studies, if you're talking about watershed hydrology and water supplies and sediment, there's studies that show, paired watershed studies that were done by Kevin Bladen, I think from OSU was part of the team, logged versus unlogged burn landscape. The logged one has 28 times, 2,800% more sediment delivery to that system. I mean, I think my read on the science, which is the Best et al. Report from the 90s, is that the recommendations from the experts was that post-fire logging was negative on ecological recovery, even if your goal is timber production, right? And it's a negative from an aquatic standpoint. So that's my read on logging or not logging in a post-fire landscape. You know, there are some things, and Tom can address this. Occasionally you see hydrophobic soils and other things that are affecting water quality. But, you know, I would just put out there that think about another aspect before I turn it over to Tom, which is the research from Julia Jones and Perry and Jones and Zald, excuse me, not Zald, Segura et al., which was part funded by the timber industry, that shows if you have a young timber plantation, like you had in 70% of the Holiday Farm Fire, and you have an older mature forest, that young timber plantation, regardless of the fire, is reducing summer flows by half, right? So basically the point is that kind of a finding will hold true in a burn landscape. You know, when Tom presents those pictures of thinned and burned, thinned, this one burned hot, I have so many questions for him about what was the wind, what was the previous management, what was the canopy, you know, that I'd love to unpack. But I just think that those, Dean, those are the things that I would give you as the overarching big picture things. I'm very concerned about heavy-handed post-fire response in terms of tree removal and future recovery. I understand that the national forests and private lands are set aside for logging, and I use and enjoy paper and wood products. So I'm not a black and white thinker. Don't get me wrong on that. But I just say that those actions have consequences, and I've seen the extent of the consequences for Highway 224 and the Clackamas River and the Santiam. And I'm very concerned, and what I've heard from the watershed councils is that those heavy-handed interventions to remove supposedly hazard trees that are live and pose no hazard are costing us a huge amount more money, making it very difficult for those wild and scenic river waterway corridors to come back. And that privately, the people running those watershed councils are like, we don't have the money to deal with this. This is a disaster for us. So I'm sorry to paint a stark picture, but that was something I lived and breathed with whistleblowers on those projects and saw it firsthand. And those are places I have personally and many friends lost homes up there, and that I personally spent a lot of time on. And I think that it's important to recognize the value of letting nature run its course. And then it is important sometimes for us to intervene, as Tom has described, and I support both. But I just put that out there that I feel I have a lot that I could present on that, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, just to pick up from that, I would certainly agree with Ralph on the complexity of these issues, and I would be very nervous about blanket approaches to anything in restoration. Coming back, I think the original question was about aquatic restoration. I'm not an aquatic ecologist, and maybe my talk reflected my terrestrial bias. But I do know aquatic responses are complicated. It depends on the nature of the stream system and the geomorphology. And I do agree that logging shouldn't be seen as a solution to everything, and that we have to carefully assess what the real impacts are going to be when we do things out there. The bootleg landscape, I think our concerns in that particular landscape are more for meadows and wetlands than high energy streams, which just aren't a feature of that particular landscape. But again, I'm all for appreciating and respecting the complexity of these systems and not taking simple approaches.
And Dean, I don't know if you have a particular interest, but I have a bunch of cameras in a beaver location on 224. And if that's of interest to you, but I've been fascinated by that and been started to spend time. I also have some on a tribal piece of ground within the Dixie fire the Mountain Maidu. I'm working with the Mountain Maidu to document a beaver restoration project. And I'm sure many of you have seen, and Tom is very well aware of the role that beavers play in fighting fire and, impounding water and creating buffers against fire. And it's really fantastic to see. The other person that, if you're interested in digging into that, that's doing a lot of work is Dr. Lisa Ellsworth, who is working on salamanders that actually key in on, they're not only aquatic species, but they key in on downed logs created by fire. And they have a particular amount of time that they spend from that log, but most of the time they're hibernating on that. She's working with a team to try to identify how burned landscapes actually create a lot of habitat for these particular types of salamanders. I'm just learning about it from the outside. I'm not an expert in that stuff either.
There's a number of interesting questions in the chat. I don't know how you want to proceed there, Gabriella.
Maybe we can take Leslie's question first, because I think she raised her hand pretty quickly. Then we can get to those.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll let all the other questions go through afterwards. And Tom, I had a quick question for you. How those post-fire restoration teams are put together? I just was wondering about the governance of them, how they're put together within the agency or outside interests, and then maybe how the bootleg's gone specifically.
Yeah, that's a good question. This particular team was contracted to an organization called American Forests, which I have not worked with before, but they seem to be very positive and constructive. And I think this was to help the forest get organized for the planning process that's necessary to do post-fire restoration. If you're asking about public involvement, I don't know what their strategy is going to be on that. I will take a moment to say I really do favor the collaborative approach, which I mentioned in my talk about, for example, the collaborative forest landscape restoration projects, but there's a lot of other collaborative work going on as well, because I think that's the future. I think that's where we're most successful. A lot of the planning regulations were written, 50, 60 years ago. In a different age, and they're still on the books. We still have to follow them, but it kind of sets up opposition whether we like it or not. It's the agency proposes and the public opposes, whereas the collaborative approach is more, we're all around the table and we're going to figure this out together. I don't claim to mean that it works perfect all the time and that everybody's always included and that everything's fair all the time. But it is a much better approach, I think, than the agency proposing and the public opposes.
Well, someone asked about cultural attitudes in the media towards wildfire, sensational journalism, product of capitalism. Wow, I love the question, Cal. That's a lot to unpack. That is my thing. And Leslie is laughing because I recently got to know Leslie and had a chat with her. And I think we hit it off because one of Leslie's complaints is someone who, as I'm just getting to know her, works on firefighter, studying these problems, is the superficiality of media. It's hard to ascribe a motive to all journalism. I will be in the camp of Tom DeMeo of things are complex and there's paradoxes, and it's hard to say, for example, that the Forest Service is a monolith of same-thinking individuals. It's not, nor is the conservation community, nor is the media and journalism. I will say there's been some really excellent reporting from the Oregonian, from Ted Sickinger, from Cassandra Profita. I really appreciated the work they've done. Tony Schick at OPB. These people double check and verify and are very careful with their reporting, and I have great degrees of respect for them. I think there's always new journalists, and I think that I will drop in that Google Drive, give me a half an hour, I'll drop some things, but I wrote a book report about this media and apocalypse book. I love it. It's so excellent. You know, so three things: fire destroys the forest, fire kills all wildlife, and fire can and should be put out. Well, let's unpack the third one. Why do we think fire can and should be put out? Well, because our efforts to suppress fire coincided with weather helping us out from the 40s to the late 80s. It was a cool, wet climate period. Paul Hesburgh says it, Chris Dunn says it, all the people that know say it. They say it in somewhat more technical language, maybe Hesburgh being the most accessible. But in other words, the weather gave us a helping hand, okay? And the thing is, what the media does is say the forests are overstocked and fire suppressed. And so therefore people believe that's true everywhere, and that they believe pulling up the saw everywhere will change those things. But what they don't appreciate is the vastness of the landscape, and that trying to make it less flammable is like, as Dr. Tanya Schuenagel says, trying to take a cup and making the ocean less wet. What took the Marshall Fire through communities outside of Boulder? A small shrub outside of someone's house. That's all it took to ignite and carry the first embers of that fire. So there's, you know, and then when we say prescribed fire and indigenous fire, and I'm totally with Tom DeMeo on we need to support indigenous burning, was that practiced differently in different landscapes by different tribes? Yes. Do we know everything about what they did? No, because that was a humongous, intricate, beautiful piece of pottery, right? Their knowledge and their practices that white settlers shattered and criminalized. And now we're trying to figure out what they did. And we've got homes everywhere and different land ownerships. So it's not so easy to scale that up. It's expensive. There's a lot of liability. There's a lot of complexity. But the media can't go deep. People are busy. They're trying to get clicks. They're trying to boil it down for folks. So, you know, and partly they are marinated in technological solutions, right? How many people believe it's possible to go to Mars and hold up Elon Musk and his quest as something that's actually a worthwhile pursuit and realistic? Way too many people. So the media reflects culture and culture reflects media and vice versa. And so that's my initial perspective on it. But what I've been trying to do is get underneath that and then just segment the fire question in a variety of ways. And with Elemental, I worked with a bunch of people, but it's really all the experts that appear in there. Dr. Jack Cohen, Dr. Chris Dunn, Dr. Beverly Law, and I've tried to bring them, help the team bring them to life and the whole range of fire questions in a way that's good for the general public to understand, right, in their busy lives. And like Tom says, how we prioritize. So it's a lot to unpack, and it's something that gets me real fired up. And Leslie was chuckling because she knows this already from one interaction with me. And I will pause there and just say, I'll put some stuff in the Google Drive that might help you try to unpack that for yourself and bring a critical eye. One thing I think the media doesn't do enough yet, but they're starting to, is think about the influence of weather. They're doing things like calling them climate fires, but I think they should really focus a lot more on the wind and the drought and the factors that are overwhelming the fuel dimension of the fire triangle, right? I think the fire triangle is no longer equilateral, and drought and wind is overwhelming the fuel component, which is the only component we can do anything about, right? And so that's why I think in general, people are so focused on that component. But what we're seeing with these big fires is they're overwhelming whatever we might have done on that component in many cases. In normal weather conditions, they're not. We're having an impact with the thinning and the prescribed burning. I'm not saying it never works. I'm just saying that factor. So it is a challenging, dominated by negative cultural norms and beliefs environment for a reporter to deal with.
Okay, we are basically out of time, but Tom, if you have a few minutes or seconds to address either the question posed by Lena, do you prioritize reforesting the edges or core of fire? In other words, are plants and fire edges recovering naturally from dispersal? And then both of you from a question from Catherine, or yeah, I guess a question. If there are programs established to prevent invasive species from coming into recently burned areas, or are they still in development?
Well, starting with the question on the edges, I think that relates to our concept of seed sources in the trees if we want to reforest that area. And that is something that gets seriously looked at. And in the bootleg example, a lot of the interior of that fire burned rather hot, so there aren't seed sources. So that's something to consider whether you want to try to reforest naturally or to plant. Another thing we consider, as I mentioned, was our departure analysis, which helps show us to have what's the right mix of seral stages for a given veg type based on the range of variation. So, for example, if our work shows that we need so many thousand acres of early seral, then maybe we don't plant those areas or we don't need to. So I think that's maybe the way to address the edge issue. And the invasives, yes, it's something that's being very seriously looked at. We don't have a good handle on it. I don't think we've ever had a really good handle on invasives, but one of the things we're doing in our collaborative monitoring is we're trying to do a better job of tracking invasives and what our treatments are, thinning and prescribed burning before a wildfire, what that does to the spread of invasives. So not a very elegant answer on invasives, but we need to do a better job of understanding that.
May I follow up with a question? Tom, if you know anything that's going on specifically, I know the bootleg went through the Gearhart Wilderness. I've worked out there, so it's wondering if there's any specific tackling both those two concerns, like your reforestation and invasive issues in the wilderness, Gearhart, at all, if there's any specific issues.
I think I can follow up on that, but I think the invasives issues are more at lower elevation. I wouldn't say that the Gearhart is without those concerns, but one of the problems too is invasives tend to show up 2 to 3 years after the fire in force, and by then it's, I don't want to generalize, but it's kind of too late to do anything about them. So that was my earlier comment, is we need to do a better job of getting a handle on these issues. I don't think the bootleg has inordinate invasives issues compared to other fires. I mean, they all do.
Cool. Yes, so we are a little over time, but I want to thank both of y'all for coming and speaking. Yeah, this is a great part 3 of the speaker series. People are interested in coming tomorrow. We have 2 more speakers and should be awesome. But thank you, Ralph and Tom, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all for your time.
Thanks. Take care.